I discovered that a coworker I'd personally trained had spent weeks impersonating my email account to sabotage me with our biggest client, timed exactly to when we were secretly competing for the same promotion. My name is Colette Fenwick, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. My manager called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon to inform me, with visible discomfort, that our biggest client had filed a formal complaint about missed deadlines and unprofessional communication on my part, citing 3 specific email exchanges I had absolutely no memory of ever sending. And it was only when she printed them out for me to review that I understood someone had been sending emails from an account that looked almost exactly like mine, off by a single transposed letter in the domain name, close enough that neither the client nor my manager had noticed the difference until I pointed it out myself. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a senior account manager at a mid-sized marketing agency in Charlotte, North Carolina, a position I'd held for 6 years, 3 of them managing our agency's largest and most demanding client relationship. 18 months earlier, I had personally trained a new hire named Persimmon Castellano, spending weeks walking her through our systems, our client relationships, and the specific communication style our biggest client expected. Mentorship I'd taken seriously because I remembered how difficult my own first months in this industry had been without similar guidance. I need to slow the story down here, because the bare facts make it sound cleaner than it felt while I was living it. Nothing about discovering I was set up to fail by the coworker I trained from her first day arrived as one neat dramatic revelation. It came in fragments, a sentence that did not belong, a date that sat wrong in my memory, a document that used familiar names in unfamiliar ways, and then the awful quiet after I realized I had to keep functioning normally, while my private life was being quietly rewritten in front of me. I want to go back to that Thursday afternoon meeting with my manager, because I don't think I've fully described how quickly ordinary professional anxiety turned into something considerably more disorienting. I remember walking into her office expecting some routine feedback conversation, maybe a minor client concern I could address with a quick follow-up call, and the specific growing confusion of reading emails that used my name, my general writing style, my job title, describing conversations and commitments I had absolutely no memory of ever making, a strange, vertiginous experience of seeing myself described inaccurately in my own professional voice. The first thing I did was make myself a timeline. I wrote down every date I could verify, every conversation I remembered, every amount of money or account number or message that might matter later. That sounds practical, because it was, but it was also a way to keep myself from spiraling. When someone you trust turns reality into something slippery, paper becomes a railing. I needed dates, names, receipts, and screenshots because my feelings were too loud to be useful by themselves. What hurt most in those first days was not only the act itself, it was the way ordinary memories began changing shape. Dinners, errands, family calls, little jokes in the kitchen, conversations I had replayed fondly for years, suddenly had a shadow under them. I kept wondering what the coworker I trained had known during those moments, what had already been in motion, and whether I had been the only person in the room living honestly. I did not immediately suspect Persimmon, and I want to be honest about that, because it took several days of confused, mounting alarm before the obvious answer settled into place. I asked our IT department to trace the spoofed domain registration, and what they found stopped me completely. The domain had been registered using a personal credit card and the registration's billing address. Once IT escalated the request through the domain registrar's fraud department with a formal complaint, matched an apartment I recognized instantly as Persimmon's own. I learned quickly that betrayal has an administrative side nobody warns you about. There are passwords to change, statements to download, records to request, calls to make during business hours, and professionals who need clean copies rather than emotional summaries. I would be shaking after a discovery. Then 10 minutes later, I would be on hold listening to cheerful music while waiting for someone to confirm a date connected to training notes. I did not confront Persimmon the moment I learned about the domain registration, and I want to explain why. I understood that a billing address alone, however damning it appeared, needed to be confirmed through additional evidence before I accused a colleague I had personally trained and mentored of deliberately sabotaging my professional reputation with our biggest client, and I needed to understand her motive before I said anything directly. The people who helped me, especially Priscilla, kept reminding me to separate suspicion from proof. Suspicion told me where to look. Proof was what would protect me when the story got ugly. That distinction mattered because the coworker I trained had already shown a willingness to shape facts around convenience, and I could not afford to hand over my anger as the only evidence I had. So I built folders, one for training notes, one for performance reports, one for messages, one for statements, one for anything that connected the timeline. I named files boring things like transfer confirmation and call notes, because I wanted the record to be usable by someone who had not lived inside my panic. Every time I saved another document, I felt both steadier and sadder. I brought my concerns to our HR director, a careful, thorough woman named Priscilla Nakamura, who authorized a formal internal investigation given the seriousness of the client complaint and the domain evidence IT had already surfaced. Priscilla's investigation, working with IT's continued forensic review, found that the spoofed emails had been sent using the same writing patterns and internal shorthand only someone deeply familiar with our client account would know how to replicate convincingly, details specific enough that Priscilla concluded whoever sent them had genuine, detailed insider knowledge of exactly how I communicated with this particular client. Knowledge Persimmon would have had direct access to from working alongside me on the account for the preceding year. There were several nights when I almost confronted the coworker I trained before I was ready. I would look across the room and feel the words pressing against my teeth, but I had already seen enough to understand that an early confrontation would give the coworker I trained time to explain away, delete, reframe, or blame me for misunderstanding. Waiting was not weakness. Waiting was strategy, even when it felt like swallowing glass. Priscilla dug into our agency's internal promotion records and found something that clarified the motive considerably. A senior account manager position, one level above my current role, had opened up 2 months earlier, a role both Persimmon and I had separately expressed interest in during our respective performance reviews, a detail our management had never disclosed to either of us as a direct competition. But that, once Priscilla laid the timeline out, aligned precisely with when the spoofed emails had begun, timed specifically to damage my standing with our biggest client just as leadership was quietly evaluating candidates for the promotion. During that waiting period, I became aware of tiny performances in my own home and work life. I answered normal questions. I made normal meals. I replied to messages with ordinary punctuation. I laughed at things that were only mildly funny because I did not want anyone studying my face too closely. Meanwhile, behind that normal surface, I was checking dates and gathering records connected to meeting summaries. One of the strangest parts was how calm I sounded to other people. When I called offices, banks, administrators, clerks, or attorneys, my voice became almost too polite. I had learned that panic makes people cautious, but calm makes them useful. I would thank someone for confirming a number, hang up, and then sit on the edge of my bed with my hands over my mouth, because that number meant my life was even less honest than I had hoped. Priscilla also found, digging through Persimmon's own company email archive under the Formal Investigations Authority, a message Persimmon had sent to a friend outside the company, roughly 3 weeks before the spoofed emails began, describing frustration that I was clearly going to get the promotion just because I trained her. Language that read, once Priscilla shared it with me, as the clearest evidence yet of a deliberate, calculated motive rather than any accidental technical mix-up. The documentation changed my grief. At first I was grieving what I suspected, then I was grieving what I could prove. That second grief was heavier because it removed the last little place where denial could hide. I could no longer tell myself there had been a misunderstanding, a mistake, or one impulsive decision. The record showed a pattern, and patterns are harder to forgive than accidents. Priscilla arranged a formal meeting with Persimmon, given the seriousness of what the investigation had found, presenting the domain registration, the writing pattern analysis, and the private message all together, with me present as the affected party but not leading the confrontation directly, a structure Priscilla recommended specifically to keep the process formal and defensible rather than emotional. I watched Persimmon's face move through a rapid sequence of denial, then a transparent attempt to minimize the domain registration as unrelated to the spoofed emails themselves, before understanding there was no version of an explanation left that could survive the complete evidence file laid out in front of her. I also had to confront my own embarrassment. I hated that I had not noticed sooner. I hated that I could look back and see moments when the truth had brushed past me and I had explained it away because trust made the innocent explanation feel more reasonable. But every professional I spoke to told me the same thing. People who deceive successfully do it by exploiting normal trust, not by leaving obvious clues on the table. That sentence helped me more than I expected. It reminded me that I had not failed some imaginary test of intelligence. I had loved, trusted, collaborated, or relied on someone who understood exactly which parts of my life were too ordinary for me to question. That is not stupidity. That is the specific cruelty of being deceived by someone close enough to know where your guard naturally rests. She did not fully confess in that meeting, maintaining even then that she didn't remember registering any domain, an unconvincing denial given the credit card and billing address evidence. But Priscilla told me afterward that the combination of evidence was more than sufficient to move forward with formal disciplinary action, regardless of whether Persimmon ever offered a full admission. By the time the evidence around email trail was clear, I had stopped thinking in terms of one confrontation and started thinking in terms of containment. I needed to protect money, records, family, reputation, housing, work, or legal standing before any emotional conversation happened. My first responsibility was no longer getting an explanation. My first responsibility was making sure the damage did not spread. Persimmon was terminated for cause within the week. Our agency's leadership, once presented with the complete investigation file, treating the sabotage as a clear and serious violation of professional conduct policy, regardless of the ambiguity around her final admission. Our agency's legal counsel also sent Persimmon a formal cease and desist regarding the spoofed domain, along with a demand that she cover the costs of the domain registrar's fraud investigation and IT's forensic review. A claim she settled quietly rather than contest further once she understood the agency was prepared to pursue it. That shift made me colder than I recognized. I was not cruel, exactly, but I became very precise. I asked questions in complete sentences. I wrote down answers as soon as I got them. I did not accept verbal reassurance when a document could verify the truth. I began to understand why people in crisis sometimes look detached from the outside. Detachment was the only thing letting me move. I remember one morning in particular when I woke up before sunrise and checked the evidence folder before I checked my messages. It had become the center of gravity. Each file inside it represented something I had not wanted to know, but also something I could now act on. There was power in that, even if it was a miserable kind of power. I personally called our biggest client's primary contact once the investigation concluded, explaining candidly, without excessive detail, that the problematic communications had come from an impersonation scheme rather than any actual lapse on my part. A conversation that felt, in the moment, more vulnerable than almost anything else in this entire ordeal, having to defend my own professionalism to a client who had, understandably, been genuinely frustrated by what they believed was my declining performance. The client was, to their credit, gracious once they understood the full circumstances, and our relationship, though shaken, ultimately recovered fully over the following months. The closer I got to confronting the coworker I trained, the more I thought about the version of myself from before. That earlier version had made plans without accounting for deception. She had believed promises, assumed good faith, and organized her future around people behaving like the people they claimed to be. I felt protective of her, and angry on her behalf, in a way I could not explain to anyone without sounding like I was talking about another person. I did receive the senior account manager promotion, roughly 2 months after Persimmon's termination, an outcome that felt, once it actually happened, considerably less triumphant than I imagined it would have felt under ordinary circumstances, given how directly it followed an ordeal that had nearly cost me my professional reputation entirely. I asked our leadership, directly, whether the promotion decision had already been made before the sabotage came to light, or whether it had been influenced by the investigation's outcome, wanting to understand clearly that I'd earned the role on my own merits rather than by default once my only real competitor was removed. My director assured me the decision had, in fact, already been leaning in my direction before any of this happened. A reassurance I chose to believe, though I understood I would likely never have complete certainty either way. When the confrontation finally came, it did not feel cinematic. It felt fluorescent and practical. There were papers on a table, a glass of water I barely touched, and a silence that lasted just a little too long after the first document appeared. That silence told me the coworker I trained recognized the evidence before any confession did. Denial came first, because denial almost always comes first. Then came narrowing. Then came context. Then came the attempt to make the worst part sound like an unfortunate misunderstanding. I had prepared myself for anger, but what surprised me was the exhaustion. Listening to someone rearrange the obvious into something softer is tiring in a way that goes deep into the body. Our office's reaction to the full story, once it became known internally, was largely sympathetic toward me, though I noticed a specific quiet discomfort among some colleagues who had also, at various points, mentored newer hires with the same generous openness I'd once extended to Persimmon, an unease I understood completely. watching people recalibrate how much unguarded trust felt safe to extend to someone whose ambitions they didn't yet fully understand. I kept bringing the conversation back to facts. Not feelings, not theories, not what the coworker I trained meant to do, not whether I had been too sensitive, not whether anyone had been under pressure. Facts. Dates, amounts, forms, messages, records. The reason I could do that was because I had waited long enough to gather the evidence connected to HR file. Priscilla told me, once the investigation concluded, that impersonation-based workplace sabotage, though less common than more straightforward interpersonal conflict or credit stealing, tended to be considerably more damaging precisely because it attacked the target's professional credibility directly with a client or supervisor, rather than simply undermining them internally where the target at least has the chance to defend themselves in real time. She said the cases that resolved most clearly for the victim almost always depended on quick, thorough IT forensics, since digital impersonation, unlike a purely verbal dispute, tends to leave a traceable technical fingerprint if someone thinks to look for it immediately rather than assuming the confusion will simply resolve itself. At several points, the coworker I trained tried to make the conversation about my reaction rather than the behavior itself. That is a common little escape hatch. If they can make you defend your tone, your timing, your suspicion, or your decision to investigate, then the original betrayal has to share the stage. I refused that stage. My reaction was not the emergency. The deception was. What I wanted, in some childish corner of myself, was a sentence that could make everything hurt less. I wanted the coworker I trained to say something so honest and complete that it would at least restore my faith in the person behind the damage. What I got instead was partial accountability mixed with self-pity, and I had to accept that remorse can be real without being sufficient. Our IT director, once the case wrapped up, mentioned to me that the specific technique Persimmon had used, a domain nearly identical to our real one but with a single transposed letter, was common enough in corporate impersonation schemes that it has its own name in the security world, a typo-squatting attack, and that our agency, like many smaller businesses, had never actually registered the common typo variations of our own domain, specifically to prevent someone else from doing exactly what Persimmon did. We registered 4 additional domain variations within the month, a small, inexpensive safeguard that felt, once implemented, almost embarrassingly obvious in hindsight, given how directly it would have prevented the entire scheme from ever being possible in the first place. The aftermath was not one clean break either. It was weeks of notices, calls, corrections, follow-up records, and small discoveries that kept arriving after I thought I understood the whole picture. Betrayal rarely ends at the confrontation. The confrontation is just the point where everyone stops pretending the old story is still usable. I still have the printed spoofed emails, the ones my manager first showed me that Thursday afternoon, kept now in a folder alongside my own training materials from Persimmon's first weeks on the job, 2 documents that together tell the strange, specific story of mentorship curdling into calculated sabotage over the span of 18 months. I look at both occasionally, not out of any lingering anger, but as a reminder of how completely someone can accept genuine generosity while quietly building resentment underneath it, a possibility I'd simply never had reason to consider before I lived through it myself. People around me wanted simple updates. They asked whether I was okay, whether things had been resolved, whether the coworker I trained had apologized, whether the legal or financial side was settled. I understood why they asked like that, but simple answers felt impossible. I could be relieved and devastated in the same hour. I could be proud of myself and still embarrassed. I could be certain I had done the right thing and still miss the life I thought I had. I also learned how uneven support can be. Some people understood immediately. Some people wanted me to move faster toward forgiveness because discomfort makes observers impatient. A few people seemed more interested in the dramatic details than in the practical damage. I became selective about what I shared, not because I was hiding the truth, but because not everyone deserved access to the rawest version of it. I mentor new hires more carefully now, still generously, since I refuse to let one specific betrayal make me withhold something I genuinely believe in providing, but with clearer, more deliberate boundaries around exactly what access and information I share during those earliest, most vulnerable months of someone's tenure. When new managers ask me why I document my client communications as thoroughly as I do, I tell them the honest, short version, that someone once impersonated my own voice convincingly enough to nearly cost me a job I'd spent 6 years building, and that the extra documentation cost considerably less than the alternative. The practical recovery required routines. I made checklists. I confirmed balances. I changed contact information. I requested written confirmations. I kept copies of every letter. Those tasks were not glamorous, but they were the steps that rebuilt the floor under me. Healing, at least at first, looked less like insight and more like not missing a deadline. There were moments when I was tempted to measure justice only by whether the coworker I trained suffered enough. I understand that impulse now, but it was not where I wanted to live. What I needed most was repair, records corrected, money returned where possible, access removed, lies documented, and future damage prevented. Consequences mattered, but revenge could not be the architecture of my recovery. The legal and administrative process forced me to become fluent in parts of life I had never wanted to study. I learned the difference between authorization and liability, between suspicion and admissible evidence, between a verbal promise and a binding written commitment. I learned how quickly people who betrayed you can become careful once they realize you are no longer relying on trust alone. I thought a lot about consent during that period, not just romantic consent, but financial, legal, professional, and familial consent. So much of what happened depended on someone assuming they could use my name, my trust, my future, my silence, or my emotional attachment without asking. Naming that helped me understand why the betrayal felt so invasive. It was not only about what was taken, it was about the decision that I did not need to be asked. The hardest conversations were the ones with people indirectly affected. Explaining enough without making the story more confusing, protecting privacy while refusing to protect lies, choosing words carefully because anger can be true and still not be the only truth someone else needs to hear. Those conversations stretched me in ways the documents never could. I kept returning to the timeline whenever memory tried to soften things. That may sound unforgiving, but it was necessary. When you have loved or trusted someone, your mind keeps offering exits for them. Maybe it was pressure. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was one bad choice. The timeline answered quietly. No, this was repeated. This was maintained. This required decisions. At the same time, I did not want the betrayal to become the only story about me. For a while it tried to. Every errand, every call, every quiet moment seemed to orbit what had happened. Eventually, I began forcing other things back into my days. Work, walks, meals with people who did not ask for every update. Small plans that belonged entirely to me. One detail that stayed with me was how ordinary the evidence looked. A line on a statement, a name in a record, a date in a filing, a form with a signature. None of it looked like heartbreak. That disconnect made me understand how much of adult disaster arrives disguised as paperwork. I became more careful after this, but I did not want to become permanently suspicious of everyone. That balance took time. I wanted better safeguards, not a smaller life. I wanted verification where verification mattered, but I did not want the coworker I trained to teach me that trust itself was foolish. The lesson was more specific than that. Trust should not require blindness. When the immediate crisis passed, I had to deal with the delayed emotion. During the investigation and confrontation, there had always been a next task. Once the task slowed down, the grief caught up. I would be doing something harmless, folding laundry or making coffee, and suddenly remember one tiny lie that had supported a larger one, and the room would tilt for a few seconds. Therapy helped, but not because it made the story nicer. It helped me stop arguing with what had already happened. I had spent so much energy trying to understand how the coworker I trained could do it, that I had neglected the more important question of what I needed now that it had been done. Understanding motive was not the same as rebuilding safety. Financially and legally, I came out steadier than I feared because I moved carefully early. Emotionally, the outcome was more complicated. There is no settlement that refunds the version of time you thought you were living. There is no signed agreement that returns the easy confidence you had before you knew how thoroughly someone could use it. Still, there were real victories. Records were corrected. Responsibility was documented. People who needed to know the truth learned it. Access that should never have existed was removed. The story no longer depended on the coworker I trained's version of events. That mattered more than I can fully explain. If there is one thing I wish I had understood sooner, it is that calm action is not the same as not being hurt. I was deeply hurt. I was also organized. Those two facts existed together. The organization did not cancel the pain. It gave the pain somewhere useful to go until I could feel it safely. I have replayed the confrontation many times, wondering whether I should have said something sharper, colder, more devastating. But the older I get, the more I value the fact that I stayed anchored. I did not need the perfect line. I needed the truth on the table and a path out of the damage. I got both. The relationship I had with the coworker I trained did not survive in the form it had existed before. In some cases, no relationship should survive that kind of deception. In others, what remains has to be rebuilt under conditions so different that it feels like a new structure entirely. Either way, the old trust was not misplaced back onto the shelf as though nothing had happened. I also stopped apologizing for documenting things. Before this, I sometimes worried that asking for written confirmation sounded distrustful. Now I see it differently. Clear records are not an insult to honest people. Honest people benefit from clarity too. The only people who resent documentation are often the ones who preferred confusion. There is a particular loneliness in realizing someone close to you had a private plan for your life that you were never invited to approve. That was the core of it for me. Whether the issue was money, family, work, identity, or marriage, the real wound was being treated as an obstacle to manage instead of a person with a right to know. I rebuilt my sense of judgment slowly. At first, every decision felt suspect because I had been wrong about something important. But being deceived does not mean every instinct was broken. It means someone supplied false information to a system that was otherwise trying to work. My judgment improved when I gave it better data. The people who stood by me did not always have brilliant advice. Most of the time, they had presence. They answered the phone. They sat with me while I sorted files. They reminded me to eat before difficult calls. They treated my reality as real without demanding that I perform strength for them. That kind of support is quieter than drama and far more useful. Eventually, I noticed that the story no longer flooded every corner of the day. It still mattered, but it stopped being the only thing that mattered. That was the first sign of real recovery. Not forgiveness, necessarily. Not forgetting. Just the return of proportion. I keep the final file stored somewhere safe, not because I want to reread it often, but because I never again want to depend on memory alone for a truth someone else once tried to blur. The documents are not my life, but they are a record of the moment I stopped letting someone else narrate it for me. What I know now is that betrayal is not only discovered, it is investigated, survived, translated into practical decisions, and then slowly outlived. The discovery is the loud part, the survival is quieter. She spent months building a fake version of me to steal my job. In the end, all it took was one mistyped letter in a domain name to unmake her real one.